ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः. So last time in the introduction we had started by discussing that while all living beings have to struggle for existence, but the difference between man and other living beings is that other beings struggle blindly without any fixed plan or purpose. But man has this capacity to discriminate between right and wrong, and he has the ability to plan, to see ahead. But while others don't have this because they work by instinct, man's intelligence is superior, and he uses his superior intellect to understand the conditions and devise plans to ensure success in his endeavor. So all the cultured people of the world, one second. All the cultured people of the world will try to lead their lives in the light of knowledge which they gain of themselves and the world. So they take into consideration not merely the immediate results of their actions, but also the far-reaching consequences. While other animals can just see a few steps ahead, man has this power to make long-term plans, and he has the intelligence to predict to some extent what his actions will lead to in future. So desire for knowledge springs from the rational nature of man, and philosophy is an attempt to satisfy this very reasonable, not only reasonable but also recommended desire. So philosophy is not merely a luxury but a necessity in the lives of all of us. In his complete works, Swami Vivekananda has also said that philosophy and psychology are the two most important subjects which a man should gain a knowledge of to lead a fruitful life. And I will again quote Swamiji. He says, "Man is a thinking being and must struggle on until he conquers death, until he sees the light." So this is the manhood of man, or rather humanhood of human beings. If they don't try to do this, then they waste their rational ability which God has given them. Because without this attempt to go forward in the struggle, man is simply an animal. There is very little difference. Qualitatively there may be a difference, because we have the power to satisfy our various desires, enjoy more, live a comfortable life. But the basic instincts, if we don't struggle for this, if we don't struggle for freedom, if we don't struggle to conquer death, we will be just above animals a little bit, that's all. So this is philosophy, this is what philosophy aims to do. Now, philosophy in its etymological sense means love of knowledge, as we have seen. It tries to know things that immediately and remotely concern man. Like what is the real nature of man, what is the aim of his life, what is the nature of the world in which he lives, is there a God, If there is a God, has He created the universe? How should we live in the light of the knowledge about ourselves, the world, and the God? When we have gained this knowledge, how should we use it? So, these are some of the many questions which arise in all thinking minds, and they have been agitating the human mind in every land from the very dawn of civilization. In all the ancient books, religious books, we find these questions and their answers. So, philosophy deals with problems of this nature and it wants an ultimate solution, not piecemeal solution. It wants to know something which will resolve all these problems. So, explaining this, Swami Vivekananda says, I quote him, our senses are limited, very limited indeed, and within these limitations exist what we call our universe. But man cannot stop there, within the bounds of the universe, he means. He is a thinking being and wants to find a solution which will comprehensively explain all the universes. He wants to see a world which is at once the world of men and of gods and of all possible beings, and to find a solution which will explain all phenomena. We see we must find the universe which includes all universes. We must find something which by itself must be the material running through all the various planes of existence, whether we apprehend it through the senses or not. If we could possibly find something which we could know as the common property of the lower as well as of the higher worlds, then our problem would be solved. Now, since the senses are limited, Swamiji says, our only hope then lies in penetrating deeper. The early thinkers discovered that the further they were from the center, the more marked were the variations and differences, and the nearer they approached the center, the nearer they were to unity. So, now Swamiji gives the example that in a circle, from the center all the radii are going. So, the further they go from the center, the distance between them increases. And the nearer they come to the center, the distance between them keeps on decreasing and finally they merge. So next Swamiji says that the external world is far away from the center, and so there is no common ground in it where all the phenomena of existence can meet. At best, the external world is but one part of the whole of phenomena. There are other parts, the mental, the moral, and the intellectual, the various planes of existence, and to take up only one and find a solution of the whole out of that one is simply impossible. We first, therefore, want to find somewhere a center from which all the other planes of existence start. And standing there, we should try to find a solution. And where is that center? It is within us. The ancient sages penetrated deeper and deeper until they found that in the innermost core of the human soul is the center of the whole universe. This is what Swamiji says. So, this total knowledge, Indian philosophers say, can only be achieved by having a direct vision of the truth. Only intellectual assent won't do. So that truth they call darshana, that truth they call tattva, and the vision of truth they call tattva darshana. So darshana means seeing, means realization, and tattva darshana is having a direct realization of that truth. So next we discuss the four main branches of philosophy. That is, first is metaphysics. The metaphysics discusses the general problems regarding reality, like nature of man, nature of God, all these things. Then comes epistemology or theory of knowledge. Theory of knowledge means, in simple words, how we know. That's all. Then comes logic, which discusses the laws of valid reasoning. Next is ethics, which investigates the problem of morality. In simple words, ethics means judging what is right and what is wrong. So next we had seen, though the basic problems of philosophy have been the same in the East and the West, and their solutions to these problems also are very similar, yet the method of philosophical inquiry differs in certain respects. So main difference is Indian philosophy discusses the different problems like metaphysics, ethics, logic and psychology, but it discusses them as a whole. It does not discuss them separately. This is called the synthetic outlook of Indian philosophy. Next, we had discussed the meaning and scope of Indian philosophy, and we had seen here by Indian we should not mean limited to the Hindus, because Indian philosophy also includes philosophy of the Buddha, the Jaina philosophy, etc. So here we should take Indian in a geographical sense, the whole of India. Okay. Next, we had seen that Indian philosophy is marked by a striking breadth of outlook, which is characterized by its unflinching devotion to the search for truth. How do we know this? You see, though there are many different schools of philosophy and their views also differ widely, but in India we see that the adherents of each school took special care to learn the views of all the other schools and did not come to any conclusion before considering thoroughly what others had to say about the subject and how their points, how their objections could be met. So this spirit led to the formation of a method of philosophical discussion. What in Sanskrit is called Shastrartha. Shastra, scriptures, and Artha. Artha is meaning. So scholars met and had discussions about what the scriptures really wanted to say. In Shankaracharya's life, we find that he had traveled throughout India and discussed the Advaita philosophy with many others who held different views, and thus he established the Vedic Dharma or the Sanatana Dharma throughout India. So when these philosophical discussions took place, those who held different views were called the Purva Paksha, and those who held the suppose someone is writing a treatise on Advaita philosophy, suppose, or someone is discussing with another scholar Advaita philosophy. So the other scholar will be known as Purva Paksha, and the person who is discussing Advaita philosophy will be known as the Siddhantin. Okay, and when he contradicts the views of other schools, it will be known as Khandana. So opposite view Purva Paksha one who is holding the view which he is propounding, he is called the Siddhantin, and the Khandana or the contradiction of other views is called Khandana. So this Catholic spirit which prompted the philosophers of India to treat other schools also with respect, this was rewarded by the thoroughness and perfection which each philosophical school attained. So, if we open any comprehensive work on Vedanta, we will have a very good knowledge of what the Buddhas or the Jainas or the Mimamsakas say on the point of contention. Similarly, if we read any good book on one exhaustive work on the Buddha or Jaina philosophy, we will also come to know what to say. Means, for example, what Advaita Vedanta also has to say on that point, on that subject. So it's a very comprehensive. That's why so many books have been written if by each school, that in one lifetime it is very difficult to master all of them. The next point which we had discussed is very clearly given in the chart which I had sent you about the orthodox and unorthodox. We had seen that orthodox, one minute, somebody is. We had seen that orthodox or astika does not mean those who believe in God, but those who accept the validity of the Vedas. And we had seen that the unorthodox or the Nastika means those who do not accept the validity of the Vedas. So in the chart you can clearly see that the Charvakas, the Bauddhas and the Jainas don't accept the validity of the Vedas, while the others, the 6 most important schools, they all accept that Vedas is supreme. And we had also discussed the important place which the Vedas have in the evolution of Indian thought. They are the earliest available records of Indian literature, and all subsequent Indian thought, especially philosophical speculation, is greatly influenced by the Vedas. So, from the chart, you can also see that the Mimamsakas and the Vedanta, they strictly adhere to the Vedic authority. Their schools may be regarded as the direct continuation of the Vedic culture. But the other 4 orthodox schools, they depend more on ordinary human experience and reasoning. So though they do not challenge the authority of the Vedas, but they base their theories more on ordinary human experience. Okay. And this we had discussed regarding the method of speculation. So according to those philosophers who base their arguments on our general experiences, on our ordinary normal experiences, they, although they don't contradict the Vedas, they don't follow it strictly as the Mimamsaka and the Vedantins do. Okay. So the viewpoint of the Vedantins and the Mimamsakas is that Vedas are the supreme authority, and if we propound any philosophy, it first must adhere to the views of the Vedas. After that, we will show how those views are also supported by logic. This was how they argued. While the other schools argued on the basis of our normal experiences, but the Vedantins and Mimamsakas, they admit that normal human experiences cannot go deep into things and cannot provide the answers to all our questions. They understand that the seers and the sages, the saints, the rishis, they had a special vision, they had a special power which is called yogic vision or supersensuous power, by which they could see things, realize things which ordinary human people cannot. So actually the approach of the Vedantins and the Mimamsakas is more humble. They admit that we don't know everything. They say that there have been much greater people than us, the rishis, the knowers of God, and they are the authority. So first we have to reason, we have to go by logic, but that logic should be supported first and foremost by what the Vedas say, because the Vedas are the words of such knowers of God. This is the difference in approach. So till here we have discussed. Now a very important point, the main difference which is there between the Western and Indian philosophy. You see, in India, philosophy is not mere speculation. In Western philosophy, what is there? Anybody can propound a philosophy, but it is not at all necessary that he will base his life on his own philosophy. He can live in one way and propound a philosophy which says completely the other thing. So his life need not be in harmony with his philosophy. Those are two separate things in the West. But in India, philosophy is not mere speculation. It is a part of life, part of our life. So as each system of thought came into existence in India, it was adopted as a philosophy of life by the followers of that system, those who formed a school of that philosophy. So if in India we say that we believe in some philosophy, we have to live that philosophy, otherwise our words have no importance. So the adherents of each school, they lived the philosophy they propounded and handed it down to succeeding generations of followers who were attracted to them through their lives and thoughts. This is the main difference. In India, if a person propounds a philosophy but does not live by it, he will be given absolutely no importance. He will have no place. See, all the great people who has propounded the philosophy, starting from dualism, Madhvacharya, from Vishishta Advaita, Ramanujacharya, Advaita Vedanta, Shankaracharya. So their lives conform to their philosophies. Otherwise, we would not have remembered them now, nobody would have read their works. Why is Swami Vivekananda respected so much? Why is Sri Ramakrishna respected so much? Why is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu respected so much? Because they lived what they taught. This is the main thing. Their philosophy and their lives were one single whole. They spoke from their own realizations. This is the main thing. That's why in India, saints are remembered even after thousands of years forever, like Tulsidas, Mirabai, Kabir, Nanak, and all the other great people. Why? although they may not have, all of them may not be intellectual giants, they may not have written great works of philosophy, but their lives were in full conformity with what they preached. This is the most important. This we have to remember. Now we come to how the philosophical systems were written down. When we start reading the scriptures, like the Gita and the Upanishads and all, of course, Gita and the Upanishads are a little different, but when we start reading the philosophical systems, we will find that all of them were written in what is now called sutra form. I will explain this. So the main thing is that the Vedas are directly or indirectly responsible for most of the philosophical speculation in India. Now, in the orthodox schools, next to the Vedas and Upanishads, we find what is called the Sutra literature. Sutra means, as you know, aphorism. Literally, it means a thread. So, in this context, Sutra means a brief mnemonic. Mnemonic, as you know, it is a learning technique which is an aid to information. So, sutras were very brief. And as philosophical discussions in those times took place mostly orally, and as they were passed down through oral tradition, the guru used to say and the students used to memorize. So, as they were passed down through oral traditions and handed thus from guru to disciple, it was perhaps felt necessary to link up or thread together the main thoughts in the minds of the students by brief statements, because it is very difficult to memorize the extensive philosophical views. So, what they did was, these brief statements were formed as an aid to remembering the whole philosophy. So, these brief statements contain the problems, the answers, and also the possible objections which could be raised against that philosophy. So, a sutra work consists of a collection of many sutras, like Vedanta, the Brahma Sutra, you must have heard, composed by Badarayana, or Badarayana is another name for Vyasa. So, the first sutra is Athato Brahma Jigyasa. Atha Brahma Jigyasa. These three words. On this, you will find a commentary filling many pages for such as these three words. So, the Brahma Sutras of Badarayana contains the aphorisms that sum up and systemize the philosophical teachings of the Upanishads or the Vedanta, and also mention the possible objections and the answers. So, all these 6 philosophical systems have not their origin, I cannot say origin, because you see, these sutra works only systemized the philosophy. Actually, the originators who actually founded the philosophical schools, we don't know. So, now the founders of the philosophy actually are those who systemize the philosophy. For example, starting from Sankhya, see, Sankhya, we have the Kapila Sutras. Now, Kapila is said to be the founder of Sankhya philosophy, but it may be that the philosophy existed before him and Kapila only systemized that philosophy. So, Sankhya, we have the Kapila Sutras. Yoga, we all know, Patanjali Sutras, Nyaya Sutras by Gautama, Vaisheshika, the Sutras by Kanada, Purva Mimamsa, the Sutras by Jaimini, and Advaita Vedanta or the Upanishads or the Brahma Sutras by Badarayana, that is Vyasa. Of course, the Brahma Sutras, we cannot say that Advaita Vedanta, we have to say Upanishads, because the Brahma Sutras have been interpreted by all schools of Vedanta. Shankaracharya has interpreted it in the light of Advaita Vedanta. Ramanujacharya has interpreted it in the light of qualified non-dualism. Madhvacharya has interpreted it in the light of dualism. So each school, in order to gain recognition, had to show that their views were supported by the scriptures. This is the main thing. If any school could not show this, if it was suspected that the views of any school were not in harmony with the views of the Upanishads or the Brahma Sutras, that means the Vedas, they would not be accepted. That is why those who synthesized the views of these schools had to show that my views are in accordance with what the Upanishads say. That is why they had, the main propounders of this philosophy had to write a commentary to show this. And these systemizations of each school of thought are in the form of sutras, as we have seen. So, in the sutras, the thought was very much condensed and much was taken for granted. Consequently, the maximum amount of thought, you can say, was compressed into as few words as possible. So, Madhvacharya quotes, Madhvacharya. They are two separate persons. You should remember. Madhvacharya is the propounder of dualism, and Madhavacharya is another scholar who has written Sarva Darshan Sangraha, which contains the thoughts of all the major schools. Okay. So Madhvacharya has also written a commentary on the Brahma Sutras or the Vedanta Sutras, in which he describes what a sutra is. So he says, actually it is not his description, he quotes from a Purana. Purana, I think you know, it is called Smriti. So Padma Purana he quotes and to explain what a sutra is. So he says, Alpaksharam asandigdham saravat vishwato mukham astobham anavadyam cha sutram sutra vido viduhu. So what does it mean? Alpa means few, aksharam, it contains only a few words. Asandigdham, sandigdha means doubt. Asandigdha means there is no doubt to its meaning. Saravat, Sara is the essence. So it contains the essence of the arguments. Vishwatomukham, Vishwa means it deals with all aspects of the question. Okay. Astobham, it means it has no repetition. And anavadyam means it is faultless. So the translation is, people learned in the sutra literature say that a sutra should be concise and unambiguous. It should give the essence of the arguments on a topic, but at the same time deal with all aspects of the question. and it should also be free from repetition and faultless. This is what a sutra should be. Okay. But in life, what should be and what actually is always differ, unfortunately. So, though this definition states what a sutra ought to be, in practice, however, the desire for brevity means they wanted to condense so much thought in so little words. So the desire for brevity was carried to such extremes that most part of the sutra literature is now absolutely unintelligible. You cannot understand. If one gives the sutras to anybody, just the sutras without any explanation, one cannot understand anything at all from them. This is the problem. So then what was to be done? They had to write commentaries on the sutras. Okay, there are various types of commentaries like Vakya, this Vrittis, then Tikas, Tippanis, and the most detailed commentary was known as Bhashya. Bhashya. So, the commentaries of Shankaracharya, Ramanuja, Madhvacharya, they are so detailed that their commentaries are known as Bhashyas. They are very elaborate. So, this had to be done because the meanings of the sutras were not at all clear. Now, each of these commentators interpreted the sutras in their own way, and each interpretation formed into a school, separate school. Like suppose Vedanta, the Badarayana Sutra has been interpreted by so many people, all those bhashyas, all those commentary stand for a different school of thought. Shankaracharya's commentary stands for Advaita Vedanta, Ramanuja for Vishishta Advaita, Madhvacharya for Dvaita or dualism. Many others are there. So, as time went on, commentaries and more commentaries were written, and sometimes independent works were also written as handbooks. For example, in Vedanta, Shankaracharya, you must have heard of the book Viveka Chudamani. That is an independent work. You must have heard of Upadesha Sahasri. That is an independent work. Then Vakya Vritti. That is an independent work. So, and at the same time, Shankaracharya has also written commentaries on the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras. But he has also written independent works. So all these grew up. The philosophical literature of the orthodox schools developed in this way. And the history of the development of the heterodox doctrines, which is called Nastika, which don't admit the validity of the Vedas, is more or less the same. That is the Bauddhas and the Jainas and the Charvakas. But they were generally not written in sutra form. That is the difference. Now the next point is, this is also very important. Although the different schools were opposed to one another in their teachings, sometimes they differed greatly, a sort of harmony also existed between them. A sort of harmony was also conceived by the Indian thinkers according to the fitness of the follower. This is very important. Who was reading them? That was very important. According to that person's aptitude, instructions were given to him. according to his fitness. Because Indian philosophers knew that all persons were not fit for all things, and that in religious, philosophical, and social matters we should take into consideration these differences and recognize that one teaching is not meant for everybody. For example, all of us have read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. We know that how Sri Ramakrishna taught each person separately. For example, when he gave special instructions to his monastic disciples, he was so careful he would go out and see that no householder was within hearing distance, because those teachings were meant only for them. If others tried to follow them, they might not understand them, or they might even come to harm. So this principle is called Adhikaravada in Sanskrit. Adhikari means one who is fit. So Adhikaravada means each person is fit for a particular teaching, and he should base his life upon that particular teaching only, or teachings only. So the different philosophical disciplines were taken as different ways of molding our practical life. Consequently, it was all the more necessary to discriminate the fitness of the followers of each school of thought. So the many systems of philosophy, beginning from the materialism of the Charvaka school and ending with the Vedanta of Shankara, were actually conceived to offer different paths for philosophical thinking and living. As we have seen in India, philosophical thinking and living are not two separate things. If you support a philosophy, your life must conform to that philosophy. So each particular philosophy is, as it were, a path for each a different mindset, depending upon the different qualifications and temperaments of human beings. And even apart from this explanation, when we read the different philosophies, we will discover many points of agreement which may be regarded as the common marks or the common symbols of Indian culture and philosophy. So these are primarily the common characters of all Indian philosophical systems are four. So we have to go through them in a little detail so that we understand clearly. So we can end here today regarding our discussion on Indian philosophy. And like last time, we can just read a little of the Mahabharata. So last time we had seen that in a concise way, we had seen what is the story of the Mahabharata. So there were these cousins, this Pandavas and the Kauravas, and the Pandu had 5 sons, and Dhritarashtra, the Kauravas he had about 100 sons, and the fight which took place between them, because the Kauravas did not want to give the Pandavas their share of the kingdom, is described in detail and forms the bulk of what led to the fight etc. forms the bulk of the Mahabharata, but in addition to that, it contains many things. The Mahabharata is such an epic and wonderful epic. There are so many illustrative tales and so many wonderful teachings besides the narrative of the Pandavas and the Kauravas. So it is in fact a veritable ocean containing countless pearls and gems, it has been said. So in praise of the Mahabharata, I will just give you a chant a shloka from the Mahabharata itself, which tells of the greatness of the Mahabharata. इतिहास प्रदीपेन मोह आवरण घातिना लोक गर्भ गृहम कृत्स्नम यथावत samprakashitam. About the Mahabharata it has been said. The meaning is itihasa pradipena. Pradeep means a lamp, and itihasa is history, but here it does not mean factual history. It means what has been handed down by tradition. That is also one meaning of itihasa. So this is like the Mahabharata is like a lamp which illumines the itihasa of India. And moha varana ghatina. Moha means delusion. Avarana means covering. Ghatina means it removes. So it removes the covering of delusion which is all over the intellect of an ordinary person's. And loka garbha griham kritsnam. So griha means the room. So the room of our heart. This is the thing. The room of our heart, what does it do? Yathavat samprakashitam. Prakasha is light. So our hearts, our minds, it illumines with the light of knowledge. This is what it is. The greatness of the Mahabharata has been described in Mahabharata itself. So it is simply wonderful. Of course, we don't have much time, so we will have to be satisfied with this one verse. Now, as we had discussed last time, that Vyasa thought up the whole Mahabharata in his mind. He was such a great sage, and he when he had whole thing, when he had imagined it in his mind, the whole plan when he had it in his mind, it is said that Brahma appeared before him. Brahma, the creator of the universe, and he said to Vyasa that only one person is fit to write your poem. Kavyasya lekhanarthaya Ganesha smaryatam mune. Muni means, oh great sage. Smaryatam, you think of Ganesha. Ganesha will come before you, and he can only write down the Mahabharata. There is nobody who can do this job other than him. So as we know, Ganesha put up a very strange condition. He agreed, but he put up a very strange condition. What did he say? Likhato navatishtheta mama lekhani kshanam. My writing, lekhani, na avatistheta, should not stop for kshanam also. Kshanam means a moment also. I will write, but you have to dictate in such a way that my pen should not stop even for a second. Then only I will agree to write down what you say. So Vyasa, what to do? He had to agree because there was nobody else who could write down the Mahabharata. So he, after saying some 1,000 shlokas or so, he inserted a shloka which was very difficult to understand. That is called the Ashkuta Shloka. So in the Mahabharata it is said how many shlokas are there which are very difficult to understand. Ashtau Shloka Sahasrani Ashtau Shloka Shatani cha. This means 8,800 verses are very, very difficult to understand. About that, about those shlokas, about the difficulty which lies in understanding them, Vyasa himself says that Aham Vedmi, I understand those shlokas because I have written them. And who else understands? Shuko Veti. Shuka is Vyasa's son. One of the greatest Paramahansas in the world, we all know. So, Aham Vedmi, I know, Vyasa says. Shuko Veti, Shuka also understands. Sanjayo Veti Vanava. Sanjaya, one who narrated the whole of the Kurukshetra war to Dhritarashtra. Since Dhritarashtra was blind, he could not see. So that Sanjaya Veti Va Nava. He may or may not understand also. So this is how difficult those shlokas were. So what happened? It is said that even though Ganesha was all knowing, in the shloka it is said, Sarvagyopi Ganesho Yat. Sarvagya means all knowing. Still, Kshanam Aste Vicharayan. When those shlokas were chanted by Vyasa, Kshanam, for a moment, he had to think about the meaning. Because he has given his word to Vyasa that I will not write down without understand the meaning. Vyasa had put this condition that okay, I will dictate at such a speed that you won't have to stop. But you have to give my word that you will not write down anything unless you understand its meaning. So Kshanam, for a moment, even Ganesha had to stop. So in that moment, what did Vyasa do? Tavat Chakara Vyasa api Shlokan Anyan Bahun api. Bahun, all the other shlokas, Anyan means other shlokas, Vyasa quickly gave a final shape in his mind. Just a moment was enough for Vyasa to compose the other shlokas. So it is said that Ganesha did not stop, and he did not have to stop because Vyasa was kept on dictating the Mahabharata in such a way. So now before we start the actual story, we have to first read about in the Mahabharata about Bhishma, because Bhishma was one of the most important characteristics, and how he took birth. He was a very special person. How his name came to be Bhishma, for what reason, then how he supported the rulers of the Hastinapur, and the great love which he had for the Pandavas and the Kauravas, of course. So Bhishma was revered by all, by the Kauravas and Pandavas. He was the greatest living warrior in his time. Even Arjuna could not kill Bhishma. That's why for the death of the Bhishma they had to go through a roundabout way, as we will all see. So next time we will start with the story of Bhishma, whose actual name was Devavrata. Devavrata. Deva is God, Vrata is vow. So his father was Shantanu and his mother was none other than Ganga. Ganga, the river Ganga, the holiest of all rivers. So a very interesting account. Of course, it would have been very good if we could have read in the original Sanskrit. Actually, there is no substitute for that. But so we will do the next best thing. We will read in a little detail in English. If I find time, I will give the parallel Sanskrit shlokas of the important verses. So I think we can stop here today. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. For the